The harbor at Crestfield Marina smelled the way expensive harbors always smell: salt water and teak oil, and the particular clean scent of money that knows it doesn't need to announce itself. The berths ran in 3 long rows from the main pier, each one occupied by something that cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime, each one gleaming in the way things gleam when someone is paid to make them gleam every morning. Owen Carr was the someone paid to do the gleaming. He arrived at 6:15 every morning in a 2009 Ford pickup that he parallel parked in the same spot on the service road, a spot technically designated for loading only that the marina manager had stopped mentioning because Owen was always there before the manager arrived and left after he had gone, and the truck had never once been in anyone's way. He was 41 years old, medium height, broad through the shoulders in the way that comes from years of physical work rather than a gym. Dark hair that needed cutting. Light stubble that was either a deliberate choice or the result of a man who had more important things to think about in the morning than his face. His hands were the hands of someone who used them precisely, not large, but certain, with the kind of economy of movement that develops when you have spent years working in confined spaces where a wrong motion has consequences. He did maintenance work at the marina: hull cleaning, bracket repair, anti-fouling paint, mechanical assists for the day sailors who couldn't manage their own lines. He had been doing it for 4 years. He was good at it, and reliable, and quiet, and the marina's owner, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had inherited the business from his father and run it competently without distinction for 20 years, considered Owen Carr the best hire he had made in a decade, without knowing very much about him at all. Owen's daughter, Macy, was 7 years old and had her mother's eyes and her father's habit of paying close attention to things. On school holidays and the occasional afternoon when Mrs. Reyes from the apartment below could not manage pickup, Macy came to the marina with her father. She sat on the dock with a spiral notebook, always the same kind, blue cover, college ruled, and cataloged every boat in the harbor, not just their names, their condition, their movement patterns, whether they had been out that day based on the water line and the state of the lines. She had developed a rating system using symbols she had invented herself, and which she had explained to her father once in considerable detail. He had listened to the entire explanation and asked 2 precise questions at the end of it, which was how he listened to everything, and which made her feel that what she had said was worth saying. She gave every boat a name of her own regardless of what was painted on the hull. The 60-foot Sunseeker in berth 14 she called Gerald, after the marina manager, because it looked self-satisfied. The weathered 32-foot sloop in berth 7 she called Margaret, which had been her mother's name, because it was sturdy and quiet and had been places. The yacht in berth 1 she had not named. She had tried several times, and each time had put her pen down without writing anything. She told her father once that the boat in berth 1 was waiting for something, and that you shouldn't name something that was still waiting because the name might be wrong by the time the waiting was over. Owen had looked at his daughter for a moment after she said this. "That's right," he said. The yacht in berth 1 was the Maren. 68 feet, Italian-built, twin 1,500 horsepower diesel engines, custom teak decking, a master stateroom that the broker's listing had described with the word incomparable because no other word presented itself. It had been built in 2015 for a man named Charles Whitfield, who had made his money in logistics and spent it on the water with the particular joy of someone who had waited his whole adult life for permission to do so. Charles Whitfield had died of a stroke in 2020, 3 weeks after his 67th birthday, on a Tuesday morning in his office in the same city where he had started his business with $4,000 in a used van in 1987. The Maren had come to Crestfield Marina in early 2021, inherited along with the rest of the estate by his daughter, Victoria Whitfield. It had not moved from berth 1 since its arrival. It had not run since its arrival. In 4 years, the engines of the Maren had not turned over once. Victoria Whitfield was 38 years old and ran Whitfield Logistics with the focused efficiency of someone who had spent 15 years learning the business from the inside, while everyone assumed she was there for ornamental reasons and who had, upon her father's death, demonstrated within 6 months that the assumptions had been wrong. She was not warm in the way people mean when they use warm as a compliment for women in positions of power. She was precise and fair and occasionally generous in ways she did not announce, and she had exactly no patience for the particular brand of condescension that suggested her competence required explanation. She wore her dark hair pulled back in a way that was practical rather than styled, and her clothes were expensive and understated, and she carried herself with the posture of someone who had decided a long time ago that she was not going to make herself smaller to make other people comfortable. She had come to the marina 4 times in 4 years, each time to meet with a specialist regarding the Maren, each time leaving without the problem resolved. The file on the yacht's mechanical failures was thinner than the one on Evelyn's Ferrari, but equally maddening in its consistent lack of conclusion. The first firm, a marine engineering company out of Fort Lauderdale with a strong reputation for twin diesel systems, had spent 2 weeks aboard and produced a 30-page report that identified 6 potential contributing factors without confirming any of them as primary. Their invoice was $34,000. The second, a British specialist who had rebuilt engines on 3 Royal Navy patrol vessels before moving to private consulting, spent 4 days, replaced the fuel injection system at a cost of $28,000, and departed confident the problem was solved. The engines did not start. He refunded $14,000 and declined to return calls. The 2 European specialists had each come with credentials and left with invoices. The Monaco shipyard's letter was professionally written and sincerely apologetic and completely useless. Total spent, just over $180,000. Total result, the Maren sat in berth 1 in the same condition it had arrived in, which was the condition of something that had been maintained and cared for, and that absolutely refused to run. Victoria had not been back to the marina in 14 months when she arrived on a Thursday morning in October. She came because Whitfield Logistics had been awarded a contract, the largest in the company's history, with a Pacific shipping consortium that required, as one of its conditions, a formal client hospitality event aboard a private vessel of sufficient scale to accommodate 40 guests. The Maren was the vessel. The event was in 6 weeks. She stood on the dock in a charcoal blazer and dark trousers and looked at the yacht the way she looked at problems in her boardroom, directly, without sentiment, assessing options. Gerald Fitch stood beside her at a respectful distance, cycling through the list of specialist contacts he was prepared to offer. He had done this before. He knew the pattern. Victoria was not listening to Gerald Fitch. She was looking at the man 30 feet down the dock who was repainting the hull brackets of a 45-foot Beneteau in the rain, working with the methodical patience of someone for whom rain was irrelevant information. "Who is that?" she asked. Gerald glanced. "Owen, Carr. He does maintenance for us. Very reliable." "Has he looked at the Maren?" Gerald hesitated. "He's not. He's a maintenance worker, Ms. Whitfield. Hull work, lines, general upkeep. The Maren's issue is a complex mechanical." $100, Victoria said. She said it the way people say things when they have exhausted the expensive options and have arrived at the point where the amount of money involved has become darkly funny to them. She walked the 30 feet down the dock. Owen heard her coming. He continued painting for the 3 seconds it took her to reach him, which was not rudeness. It was the completion of a brush stroke that would have been wasted if interrupted. He set the brush down and turned. "The Maren," she said, without preamble. "Berth 1, twin 1,500 horsepower diesels. Won't run. 4 firms have tried and failed. I'll give you $100 to take a look." She said it without the cold little smile. She was not performing cruelty. She was stating a transaction she genuinely expected nothing from, which was in some ways worse. Owen looked at her, then he looked past her at berth 1, at the Maren. He had looked at the Maren every working day for 4 years. He had cleaned the teak decking twice at the request of the harbor master. He had replaced 2 corroded dock cleats on the berth. He had, each time, not gone near the engine compartment, not looked at the engine hatches, not allowed himself to think about what was underneath them. He looked at the Maren for 4 seconds. Then he looked at Victoria Whitfield. "Keep the 100, he said. "I'll look at it." He turned to find Macy, who had migrated from her usual spot and was now sitting on the dock directly adjacent to berth 1, her notebook open, her pen hovering, looking at the Maren with the expression of someone who has been waiting for something to happen and has just felt the first indication that it might. "Stay on the dock," Owen said. "I know," she said, without looking up. He went aboard alone. Victoria watched from the dock. Gerald Fitch stood beside her with the expression of a man who had learned to manage his own expectations and was currently managing them aggressively downward. Owen opened the engine hatch covers in the order he would have opened them 12 years ago. Port side first, then starboard, then the secondary access panel on the center line. The sequence was in his hands before he thought it. The way a language you haven't spoken in years comes back in the grammar before it comes back in the words. The engines were MTU 12 V2000 M93S. German-built, high-performance marine diesels that had been the standard specification for vessels of this class for 20 years. Owen had rebuilt 2 of them in the North Atlantic in 2009, working in a compartment the size of a large closet in Sea State 4 while the vessel moved. He had done it in 11 hours. The record for that class of engine in those conditions was 14. He had never told anyone that. He crouched over the port engine and looked at it the way he always looked at engines that had been worked on by multiple people in succession, carefully, without assumption, looking for what the previous hands had touched, and what they had missed, and what they had created by touching things they didn't fully understand. He saw the replaced injection system immediately. British work. He recognized the installation pattern. Competent but addressing the wrong system. He saw 2 additional components that had been disturbed and replaced by the Lauderdale firm. He saw what they had been looking at and understood why they had looked there and understood equally why it hadn't worked. He was quiet for a long time. Then he took a small flashlight from his jacket pocket and directed it at a section of the engine that none of the previous specialists had accessed. Behind the primary seawater cooling pump, at the junction of the cooling circuit and the engine block, there was a secondary thermal bypass valve. On the MTU 2000 series, this valve was not listed in the standard service manual. It appeared in a technical addendum that MTU had issued in 2004 to address a specific issue with vessels operating in variable temperature sea conditions, an addendum that was available through the manufacturer's technical library and that almost no independent marine engineers had in their possession because it predated the current generation of digital service documentation. Owen had read it in 2003 when it was first circulated through the Royal Navy's Engineering Division. He had memorized it in the way he memorized most technical documents, not deliberately, but through the same close attention that made him good at his work. The valve was seized, not corroded, not damaged. Simply seized, frozen in a closed position by a calcium deposit that had built up gradually over years of inactivity, blocking the thermal circuit and triggering a continuous fault condition that the engine management system interpreted as a critical temperature anomaly, preventing ignition as a protective measure. It was not a complicated problem. It was an invisible one, unless you knew the valve existed. Owen looked at it for a long moment. He thought about the 4 firms, and the $180,000, and the Monaco shipyard's letter. He thought about the 12 years of his life that had given him the specific piece of knowledge that made this valve visible to him and invisible to everyone else. He thought about the last time he had been in an engine compartment on a vessel in the water. That was 4 years ago. It had been a smaller boat. The engine had been fine. It was everything else about that day that had not been fine. The weather, the timing, the decision that should not have been made, and that he had not been there to prevent because he had already left the Navy and was on the dock in a different harbor, watching from the wrong side of the distance when the call came. His wife's name was Sarah. She had gone out on a friend's boat on a Sunday afternoon in September. The weather had changed. She had been a confident sailor. She had been 34 years old. Macy had been 3. Owen exhaled. He looked at the seized valve. He went back to his truck and retrieved a specific tool from his secondary toolbox, a box that he kept locked, that he had never opened at the marina, that Macy had asked about once and that he had told her was equipment from a previous job. He returned to the Maren. He worked for 3 hours and 40 minutes. He freed the valve. He flushed the cooling circuit. He tested the bypass function through a manual cycle to confirm the thermal path was clear. He checked every connection the previous firms had touched and corrected 2 installation errors that were not causing the primary fault but would have created new ones within 6 months. Then he closed the secondary access panel, then the starboard hatch, then the port hatch. He climbed out of the engine compartment and stood on the deck of the Maren for a moment. The harbor was around him. The water moved under the hull in the small, constant way water moves. Patient, indifferent, continuous. He had not stood on a vessel on the water for 4 years. He had not realized, until this moment, that he had been waiting for a reason to. He went to the helm. He pressed the port engine start. The MTU turned over on the second rotation. The sound it produced was low and deep and authoritative, the sound of 1,500 horsepower waking up after 4 years of silence, and it carried across Crestfield Marina in the way that specific sounds carry across water, cleanly, completely, reaching everything in range. He pressed the starboard start. The second engine turned over on the first rotation. Both engines running. Both temperature readings nominal. Both systems showing green. Owen stood at the helm of the Maren and listened to the engines run. On the dock, Macy had put down her pen. She was standing up, looking at the yacht, with an expression her father had never seen on her face before. Not surprise, not excitement, but something more specific. Recognition. As though something she had been looking at for a long time had just shown her what it actually was. Victoria Whitfield stood completely still. Gerald Fitch had his hand over his mouth. Owen shut the engines down after 5 minutes, long enough to confirm stability, short enough to preserve fuel. He came down the gangway onto the dock. He had his flashlight in his jacket pocket and the specific tool in his hand, which he would return to the locked box in his truck. Victoria was waiting at the foot of the gangway. She had recovered her composure in the way that competent people recover composure, quickly, completely, without erasing what had just happened. She looked at him. "What was it?" she asked. "Thermal bypass valve on the cooling circuit. It's behind the primary seawater pump on both engines. Same fault, same cause. Calcium deposit, seized closed. The engine management system reads it as a temperature fault and prevents ignition." She waited. "It's in a technical addendum MTU issued in 2004. It's not in the standard service documentation most marine engineers use." "How do you know the addendum?" Owen looked at her steadily. "I read it when it was first circulated." "When you worked where?" A pause, not evasion. Consideration of how much was necessary. Royal Navy, he said. Chief Marine Engineer, 12 years. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. She looked at his paint-stained work jacket, at the dock behind him, at the locked toolbox he was carrying back to his truck. "Why are you," she began. "Repainting hull brackets?" he said. "Because someone has to." She was quiet. Macy had come to stand beside her father in the way she came to stand beside him when she had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. She looked up at Victoria with the frank assessment that children apply to adults they are meeting for the first time. "I'm going to name her now," Macy said. Victoria looked down at her. "Excuse me? The boat. I've been waiting to name her." She opened her notebook to the page for Berth 1, which had been blank for 4 years. She wrote something. "I'm calling her Sarah." Owen went very still. Victoria looked between the child and the man. She read what was in his face, not all of it, but enough. "That was your wife's name," she said quietly. It was not a question. "Yes," Owen said. The harbor moved around them. A pelican landed on the far pier. Somewhere in the middle berths a boat's radio played something that was immediately lost in the wind. "I'm sorry," Victoria said. Owen nodded once. "So am I." Macy closed her notebook. She had written the name in her careful handwriting and drawn the small symbol she used for boats that had completed their waiting. She did not fully understand everything happening between the adults. She understood the important part, which was that her father had done something today that he had not done in 4 years, and that something in him had shifted back toward a position it had left when she was 3 years old and too young to know what she was losing. She reached up and took his hand. He looked down at her. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Gerald Fitch called Owen into his office the following morning. He had, since the previous afternoon, spoken with Victoria Whitfield by phone for 22 minutes. He had also done what he should have done 4 years ago, which was look at Owen Carr's employment application. He had looked at the section on previous employment, which read, Royal Navy, Chief Marine Engineer, 2005 to 2017. He had looked at the qualifications section. He had sat at his desk for a while after that. "Why didn't you tell me?" Gerald asked. Owen considered this. "You didn't ask what I knew," he said. "You asked whether I could paint and whether I'd show up on time." Gerald had no good answer for this because it was accurate. "The Maren," he said. 4 firms. $180,000. You fixed it in under 4 hours. 3 hours and 40 minutes, Owen said. "I need to—" Gerald paused. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do here, Owen." "Nothing," Owen said. "I like the work I do. You could be running a marine engineering firm." "I could," Owen said. "I'm not." He went back to the dock. He had 3 hull cleanings scheduled and a bilge pump replacement on a 40-foot Catalina that had been making a noise its owner described as concerning but intermittent, and that Owen had already diagnosed from the description as a failing impeller that would become significantly more concerning within 60 days. Macy came after school. She sat in her spot with her notebook. She had added Sarah to the Berth 1 entry in her personal registry, with the date and the weather conditions and the sound of the engines, which she had described as low and very serious, like when Dad is thinking. Victoria returned to the marina 2 days later. No appointment. She came in the afternoon and walked to where Owen was working and stood in a way that communicated she was there for a conversation rather than a transaction. "I want to ask you something," she said. "All right." "The contract we have, the hospitality event, 40 guests, 6 weeks." She paused. "I'd like you to be aboard, not to serve, to manage the vessel, as the engineer." Owen straightened. Gerald has arrangements for day sails with competent day captains, Victoria said. This is a different vessel now. It runs. I would like someone aboard who understands what it's running on. Owen looked at the Maren in berth 1, at the clean white hull, at the name that wasn't painted on it but that Macy had written in her notebook. One condition, he said. Name it. Macy comes. Victoria looked at the 7-year-old on the dock, who was currently engaged in an intense study of a visiting 52-foot oyster that she had not yet named. She can have the bow deck, Victoria said. She'll want to be in the engine room, Owen said. Victoria looked at him. Something moved in her expression, not amusement, but its close relative. Then she can be in the engine room. I'll be aboard. The morning of the event was clear. October on the coast. The specific clarity that October produces when it decides to be generous. The air clean enough to see detail at distances that summer haze erases. Owen arrived at 5:30. He ran both engines for 20 minutes. He checked every system the previous specialists had touched, and the ones they hadn't. He walked the vessel boat astern with the attention of someone for whom attention is not a performance but a practice, something so habituated it required no effort and missed nothing. Macy arrived at 7 o'clock with Mrs. Reyes, who had agreed to stay aboard in a non-nautical capacity and who had packed sandwiches in a quantity suggesting she did not fully trust the catering. Macy went directly to the engine room. She stood between the 2 MTU diesels with her notebook open and looked at them with the expression she used for things she was learning. Owen had explained the thermal bypass valve to her the previous evening in terms she could understand, and she had asked 4 questions, each one more precise than the last. This valve was frozen, she had said, summarizing. Yes. And it stopped the engine because the engine thought it was too hot. It thought there was a risk of overheating, so it protected itself. Macy had considered this. That's what you do, she said. When something hurts, you stop. Owen had looked at his daughter across the kitchen table. Yes, he said. That's what you do. But you fixed the valve, she said. Yes. So now it can run without thinking it's going to get hurt. He had not answered immediately. He had been quiet long enough that Macy looked up from her notebook to check on him, which she did periodically in the way she had learned to do without making it obvious. Something like that, he said. She nodded, satisfied. She wrote something in the notebook. He did not ask what. The guests arrived at 9 o'clock. 40 people from the shipping consortium, from Whitfield Logistics, from the network of relationships that had built both companies over 2 decades. They came aboard in the way wealthy people come aboard luxury vessels, with the practiced ease of people for whom this was not unusual and the slightly heightened alertness of people who recognized that this vessel was something specific. Victoria was the last aboard. She stood at the aft rail and looked at Owen at the helm. He pressed the port engine start. It turned over on the first rotation. He pressed the starboard start. First rotation. Both engines running. The Maren, alive under them, vibrating with the low authority of 3,000 horsepower doing what it was built to do. Owen released the lines. He took the Maren out of berth 1 for the first time in 4 years. Through the harbor channel, past the other berths, past the maintenance dock where his truck was parked in its spot on the service road, past the Pelican Pier, out through the breakwater into open water. The sea was calm, a light northwest wind. The engines settled into their cruising rhythm, steady, certain, the sound of something running exactly as it should. Macy came up from the engine room and stood beside him at the helm. She looked at the water ahead of them. She had never been on a boat this size. She had never, that she could remember clearly, been on the water with her father. "Dad," she said. It's big out here?" "Yes," he said. She looked at the horizon, at the water stretching out in every direction, the specific blue of October coastal water deep and clear. "Is it okay?" she asked. She did not specify what she meant. She did not need to. Owen looked at the water, at the horizon, at the place where the sea met the sky in a line so clean it seemed deliberate. He thought about Sarah, about the Sunday afternoon in September 4 years ago, about the dock and the distance and the call that came. He thought about the engine compartment and the seized valve and the sound of the MTU turning over for the first time in 4 years. About the specific moment when something that has been frozen in one position begins to move again. "Yes," he said. "It's okay." Macy nodded. She opened her notebook. She wrote the date and the time and the weather conditions and the sea state, and then, at the bottom of the entry, one additional line. Dad went back on the water today. The engines ran perfectly. So did he. She closed the notebook. She put it in her jacket pocket. She stood beside her father at the helm of the Maren as the harbor shrank behind them and the open water opened ahead, and the engines ran below them with the steady, patient authority of something that had waited 4 years for this and was not in any hurry now that it had arrived. The Maren ran. The man at the helm ran with her, and the girl beside him wrote it all down so that neither of them would forget. 3 weeks after the hospitality event, Whitfield Logistics signed the Pacific Shipping Consortium contract. It was the largest in the company's 37-year history. Victoria Whitfield sent Owen a letter, not an email, a letter handwritten on personal stationery. It said, "Thank you for the $100 worth of everything." Owen read it at the kitchen table while Macy ate breakfast. She asked what it said. He read it to her. She thought about it. "You should frame it," she said. He did. It hangs in the garage above the locked toolbox, which is not locked anymore.